everyone, welcome to another Random Talk Sunday, and today I thought it would be interesting to briefly address a topic that um, I think is one that I kind of wanted to talk about for a while, but I haven't gotten around to it. But now I'm able to talk about it, and I thought it would be interesting considering the fact that I kind of do address entertainment a lot on my channel, so I figure why not talk about a form of entertainment that has been sort of a part of, I think, a lot of the sort of, I guess, human narrative throughout civilizations and stuff, and is translated pretty much today within our world through various forms of entertainment. And that topic is superheroes. Yes, superheroes. The interesting thing about superheroes is that if you really look at a lot of stories, and if you look at really history, really superheroes were sort of the superhero kinds of stories were really the first kinds of stories that human civilization sort of adopted. For example, for example, Hercules, you could technically classify as a superhero. He has abilities that no human necessarily has, and he goes out and does various labors in order to gain some kind of redemption for himself. And the superhero narrative has been something that has been very ingrained within entertainment, and it has been ingrained within history. Hercules, though, is a really prime and big example of this, but there are probably tons of other different ancient legend stories that I haven't heard about that do kind of address this similar narrative of a person who has this magnificent, extraordinary ability, and he or she goes out and sort of redeems themselves in some way, shape, or form. So not only does the superhero concept stem from history and has sort of shaped storytelling, it's also shaped the way in which we tell stories. Because usually with superheroes, they start off as ordinary, and then something happens to them, and then suddenly they gain this extraordinary power, and then they have maybe some tragedy happen, and then they go out and they sort of have this kind of redemption, and they save the day, so to speak. And that's really storytelling in a nutshell. If you take out the whole superhero angle, that's pretty much the entirety of basic narratives, through television, through movies, through books. All are based around this kind of superhero or hero concept, like that this person has this ability that nobody else can or nobody else has, and that person carries that throughout his journey. So I find the superhero concept to be really fascinating, and is one that I think has really stemmed from a lot of different cultures and a lot of different understandings, but it still has this very human element to it. And I will say that although I appreciate comic books and their art, like I like seeing pictures maybe like on Pinterest or things like that, of comic books and things of that nature, but I don't necessarily read them. I'm more of a fan of the films more so than I am of the comics. And again, usually the comics I hear are probably better written as opposed to a lot of the films that get adapted from the comics, in particular superhero comics that I'm addressing here. But just the way that it's formatted, and just having to look at it and read it in this way, I just feel very, it just doesn't appeal to me. I like seeing the images, but the way things are, the way they present like action and things like that, that to me just doesn't seem to flow as well as it does when you see it on a film screen, because you see somebody going around and actually punching somebody, or at least it looks more like they're actually punching somebody, or you don't have some like weird sound effect, or that they have to show like in the in the illustration. So again, comic books have always seemed a little bit more childlike to me. I totally understand if there's people who are adults who enjoy them, but for me personally, it again, everybody I think has their own taste of what they like that transitions over into adulthood. And comic books just weren't that for me personally. I just thought that they were just too kiddish. Even if some of them do display like adultish kind of material, since it's portrayed in such a serious way, it's hard for me to take it seriously when it's drawn like in like as a cartoon, whereas with like adult comedy shows, like I can, not take it seriously. But when it's something kind of serious, usually comic books do have that, it's hard for me to take it seriously when it's in that illustrated format. So again, it's something that's not for me, but and is just a little bit too childish for my taste. But I understand if some people really do enjoy them. And I think there's a lot of appreciation that can come from comic books, and I totally get behind all of the artists and people who contributed a lot of time to making them and to creating these really wonderful stories, but um, they're just not for me to read. I like reading books how books look, and I like watching things like how I would watch something. So when it's translated into both, it just kind of it just doesn't suit me. It just doesn't entertain me as much. Um, uh, but uh, there's an interesting thing about superheroes in that the comic books really started like within around the 20th century, I should say. Superheroes were really though the 20th century sort of version, I guess, of like the Greek gods, or like heroes or demigods, kind of like Hercules, and you know people who had like extraordinary abilities, things like that. Comic books, I think, were a way of transcending that, into sort of making a fictional kind of world, surrounding whoever they were trying to create, like Superman or Batman, or the various Avengers like Tony Stark, or Black Widow, so on and so forth. Spider-Man. I've noticed that these superheroes often have kind of a common pattern, though, and I think this pattern relates again to the whole story of redemption narrative, where you usually have some kind of tragedy that ultimately ends up happening to the superhero before he becomes a superhero, or he's just discovering his identity as a superhero. And then ultimately he has to go out through basically the entire set of storylines of him or her going up against various obstacles, and then ultimately saving the day. Um, Usually superheroes of the 20th century were they're sort of treated more like outcasts. Whereas the ones with the Greek gods, they were treated like, like the greatest things ever. Like they're just so awesome, like Hercules was just unbelievable, he was like men among men, he whereas the superheroes in the 20th century, um, the ones that revolved around Batman and Superman, those characters, they're treated as sort of like, more of they're, again, people praise them, but again, there is this sort of stigma attached to them because they're seen as different, as outcasts, as you know, incapable of being normal. Um, so so I think that was an interesting twist that these comic book writers were sort of giving, or artists were giving sort of to these various characters within the 20th century. Whereas before, usually superheroes, really technically speaking, like Hercules and whatnot, they were considered like these great thing. People like Achilles, they're considered like these great, unbelievably fits of superhuman ability. Whereas the superheroes in the 20th century kind of they're almost a little unappreciated, even feared at times. You'll see this within Spider-Man. You'll see this within Batman, Superman, same thing. They have this similar narrative. Some people might be bothered by that because, again, it kind of makes the superhero kind of cliche. But even then, it still goes back to the essence of the hero's journey, of the hero having something happen to him or her, and then they go off on their journey, and then suddenly they ultimately achieve some kind of goal at the end. So I think that's something that's really stuck to the core of superhero-dom. It's just we transcended it now more to people being different, outcasts, whatnot. X-Men's another perfect example. So we kind of made superhero films really focus on that idea of, these people being kind of different, and society kind of pushes them aside. But ultimately, when society needs their help, they're the ones that go and get the job done. So it's kind of a society needs you, but on the one hand, we don't want you kind of thing. Um, it's kind of like that saying within The Dark Knight. If you, uh, I'm not the paraphrasing here. I apologize if I'm butchering this, but I swear it's supposed to be like he's Batman says something to the effect, "I'm not the hero that they want, but they're the hero that they need, so to speak." Society doesn't really accept Batman as a part of them, but when they need him because nobody else can do what Batman does, similar to what other superheroes can do, but what a normal human being couldn't. So that's kind of the idea, is that these people have creative and interesting abilities that are unlike anything that people have seen. What I think is also really fascinating about superhero films, in particular superhero concepts, is the idea of the villain, of the adversary. Usually, the way that the villain is constructed within superheroes is they're usually given some kind of, usually superheroes are given kind of like a main villain. You know how like the main villain of Batman is like the Joker. With Spider-Man, it's probably the Green Goblin that usually people remember. With I guess you could say with X-Men, Magneto in some way. Um, it's they have all of these different different main adversaries. Avengers, you could say. The brother of Thor. I apologize, I don't remember his name. I'm so horrible with names. I apologize. But there is always the kind of main adversary. Usually they have like maybe there's like always tons of different villains that go around, and then some of them are kind of like anti-heroes. For example, Catwoman is kind of like a anti-hero, you could say. But they all have these. They have all these different villains that they're fighting against, but there's kind of like a main villain that usually people remember and usually people associate with as the villain to this one particular superhero. Um, so I think villains are a very fascinating concept. Um, whereas with older material, usually we didn't really see this villainy concept. For example, within Hercules, his myths were all based around. Well, I guess you could say his adversary would be Hera. Even though he doesn't fight against her, he just fights against his um, he fights to redeem himself, so to speak. He doesn't fight her per se. I guess he just kind of fights what I don't know if she makes the deeds or the however that you call them, where he has to go to he has to basically defeat all these different monsters. I don't know if she's responsible for creating them, but I know it labors. That's what he calls it. That's what they call it, labors. He goes through all these different labors, but I'm not sure if she created those labors or not for him to do, or if those were just so he could relieve his guilt and his shame and his redemption and redeem himself. Because again, he does do something bad. Um, these are again ingrained similar concepts like within Spider-Man. You know how um, Peter Parker unintentionally um, feels like he played a role in um, his uncle's death, so to speak. So there are these similarities between the two of trying to have redemption, but usually with more of the modern superheroes, it's usually a main villain that they have to go up against. There is a main adversary. There is someone that's trying to tear them down for whatever reason, and they sort of have a representation uh, with themselves. For example, the Joker is um, within the Dark Knight series, for example, he sort of represents, anarchy, chaos, and whatnot, and Batman's supposed to be about order and justice and whatnot. So again, they do have these contrasting um, ideals kind of going at each other. So it's like these two massive egos, and that's why I find superhero films in particular to be so entertaining, is just to see these two egos go up against each other. That's really a lot of fun to watch, and I think it makes for very intriguing storylines. So when they have these kinds of villains, I find them to be really fascinating. And I think superheroes have done really a good job of kind of making that mold rather unique compared to other kinds of genres. Um, Now, again, I understand that the films usually of superheroes, again, there are good films out there that do have good representations of the superheroes. Um, the Dark Knight, again, some people might say that they're an overrated series. I don't think they're necessarily overrated. I think they're good in their own respects. I haven't seen the third one, but I heard the third one was probably the weakest out of the three, so I didn't see it. But regardless, there is this intelligence about it, at least with these kinds of films. Um, Whereas you look at something like Batman and Robin and you wonder how does this any way represent Batman or try to bring something new to Batman? So yeah, there's kind of like a spectrum when it comes to superheroes as to how good and how bad the films are, and how they represent the heroes and how they represent the villains and whatnot. And again, there is that fan base that the writers have to sort of appease to, while at the same time maybe appeasing to people who probably don't really know too much uh, about the comics or whatnot. So again, I think that's a hard line to sort of draw. So I can understand why the films usually sometimes don't end up working um, working for, they don't work in the sake of making the film good, maybe because they don't really um, borrow the good enough material to use to make into a film. So, which I kind of don't understand is if they had really good material for the comic books, I don't get why they don't just use the material. It's just plain written right there in text. Why not just use it? But yeah, I think sometimes the films feel that they have to try to put something new into the material in order to somehow maybe make it better. But again, that sometimes ends up backfiring. Spider-Man 3 is probably a perfect example of that. I could say Batman and Robin too, but really they kind of just go on a spectrum of how good the superhero films are and how bad superhero films are. So it's just kind of like a spectrum, a bell curve, so to or well, or however you call this curve. I apologize. It's been a while since I've done graphical math, so uh, exponential curve, I guess you could say. There you go. It's kind of like an exponential curve. You know, you have the really bad stuff on the top, and then you just kind of gradually go up, and then you go down. It's a spectrum. Um, but um, I think another thing that really does, I think, make superheroes unique is the fact that they're out there trying to sort of make a difference. I think people like that idea of going out there and helping somebody, you know, like a complete stranger, you know, doing what maybe the law can't do, you know, so to speak. That's kind of, in particular, the superheroes of more nowadays and when they were made within the 20th century, you know, they really brought that spirit home. That idea that, um, you know, you know, one person can make a difference. Uh, and you know, that's kind of the sort of idealism that comes with being sort of that superhero. It's like this idea of I'm one person with this great ability, and I'm gonna use it in order to better society. And that's really what superheroes are about, usually in general. They're about making that difference within other people's lives. And I think a lot of people can find that very inspiring and very uplifting to see people helping other people out and, you know, making a difference. You know, that's always nice. And, you know, it's nice too that they don't, you know, usually superheroes, um, unless you count maybe X-Men who are really pushing in that whole difference thing, you know, a lot of the time superheroes don't really take the differences they have from society personally. Like, you know, someone like Batman, he doesn't care that he's different. He doesn't care what anybody thinks of him. He just goes off and does his own thing, and he's happy uh, doing that. And, you know, kind of the same with Spider-Man. I mean, he's goofy and kind of has this eccentricness about him, and, you know, you can tell he's a kid, but at the same time, you know, he accepts who he is. You know, he accepts the fact that he goes off and does these things. So there is this really, I just find it so fascinating that the whole, you know, make a difference. You know, just, you know, just because you're different, you don't go, oh, I'm different, oh, huh. No, you go out there and you make a difference, and you don't care about, you know, how people see you. And I think that's something that really appeals to a lot of people. The whole idea of I'm gonna go out there and do something, um, and not caring what anybody else thinks of me. So I think that's something that's very that gets people invested. Also, I think superhero films, in particular comics books too, they try to give this escapist kind of genre and create this fantasy. Again, sort of similar to the superheroes more of old, like Hercules and stuff. They try to create this fictional world where there's all these different kinds of things that exist, and they sort of create this fantasy where, you know, you can fly or you can have super strength, or you have the abilities of such and such. I mean, granted, there's superheroes that don't really have like, you know, supernatural or out of the ordinary abilities. Like, for example, Batman, he just uses all of his cool fancy gadgets because he's a super rich um rich billionaire. um so there are different ways in which people approach the whole superhero thing, as far as escapism goes. But I think the real desire of escapism is being able to do things that the superheroes are capable of doing. Like when you see Spider-Man flying like across all the buildings and stuff, you just want to go, "Oh my God, I would love to do that. It's so cool." So it's very, again, escapist, like totally appealing to people's fantasy and taking them away from reality. And I think that's why a lot of people liked the idea of putting comic books within film, because again, film's a way to escape, and perfect outlet is giving your main character some really cool ability. Um, and there's also certain things that, within various superhero comics where there's like certain kinds of um, plot elements within them, and different kinds of lore, I think, surrounding them. For example, Thor, like, there's this whole other world in which he exists, and, the way it operates is totally different from, our world. So, again, there's this kind of lore, I think, surrounding some of these superheroes. But I'm totally ignorant on that because I'm not someone who knows a whole lot about comic books. But I do know that there's sort of this 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 side to them that reinforces this kind of, you know, again, this different, either different worlds or different ways in which how things are operated within the world. So it's like, again, there's this kind of lore around some of the comics. Um, and again, even the heroes of old, like Hercules too. The fact that there's this thing called demigods, which Hercules was. His mom was human, and his father was Zeus, who's the big daddy god of all the Greek gods. So again, that kind of lore, I think, transcended when these comic book artists started making these superheroes. Again, I think a lot of influence was from all of these different cultures, ancient cultures. And yeah, I think that's really ultimately all that I could cover when it comes to this topic. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things that I think can come out of, superheroes, and of the whole idea of being a hero, and what it means to be a hero, what it means to be a villain, what it means to be, all of these um, different things. But I think that the hero's journey is just something that's been a very human element for a lot of the time within our sort of human history and evolvement. It has been about um, surviving and learning to adapt, and you know fighting for the things that you hold dear to you. um, and I think superheroes were sort of that outlet for people. And um, it, and again, there might have been, artists and others who felt maybe like outcasts, and then all of a sudden they make this, this character, and they're suddenly the hero. And I think that's what a lot of people get behind with superheroes, is the fact they they create that identity unto themselves, and then it makes them feel good about themselves. Again, you could argue it's sort of a boost of ego, but at the same time, I think it's really designed to be for good intentions, um, because it's not boosting your ego for the sake of, you know, um, for the sake of doing harm as much as doing good. Even though, again, you'll see how sometimes superheroes, their egos can kind of get in the way of really doing good. So, that ends up playing sometimes within the comics. But usually, and most of the time, ultimately, superheroes end up doing things for the greater good, so to speak. Um, but yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say when it comes to this topic. I think it's a very fascinating concept, the superhero, and I think we'll continue seeing it evolve over the years. I think since superheroes are probably more in the mainstream now, especially with a lot of superhero films that have been made over the years, I think people are kind of growing to accept it as part of like, kind of it's sort of resurrecting itself. Because it used to be comic books used to be fairly niche, but now that they're in films, they're kind of brought into the mainstream, and I think more people are kind of getting behind and are super invested in superheroes. I'm sure everybody has their favorites, and they have ones that they don't particularly care for. Um, like some, for example, even I understand the concept of Superman, and I know he was probably one of the first, technically, superheroes of the 20th century. Um, yeah, he's too perfect, at least for my taste. He's just he has everything. His only downfall is just this kryptonite, and I just go, really, that's the only flaw, nothing else. So yeah, it's kind of hard to get behind a hero when he's pretty much perfect in practically every way, shape, or form. Um, Not that I necessarily dislike Superman. It's just not one of my favorites. So again, there's gonna be people who like whichever ones they like and dislike whatever ones they don't like. Um, but I'm pretty open to a variety of superheroes. I just think there's ones that I gravitate towards too than others. Like I like Batman. I do like Spider-Man. Things like that I can get behind, but some other ones are just not really that interesting. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say though for this topic. But I am more than happy to hear your thoughts and any questions, comments, or concerns that you may have. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.